Good morning, everybody. It is Monday. Zachov Zayin Menach. 27 days in the month of the consoling Father, of the Father who consoles. Men Gate zu Chedesh Harachim Basliches. Right, Chedesh Elos, Chedesh HaCheshbon. When we take stock of how the previous year went and how much better it could be or it should be, and we figure out how we're going to improve it. Last night I did a question on my Inside Hasidus group. The question was, how is the best way to prepare ourselves for Rosh Hashanah? And I said that the best way to prepare ourselves for Rosh Hashanah is how to utilize Elul, how to utilize Elul. And I said the way you do it best is being very specific and very deliberate, not to allow the emotions of the time to take over the proactivity. In other words, in Elul there's a certain regesh, a certain emotion that has to do with the time, the feeling that you're closer to HaKadosh Baruch Hu because it's Malach Basada. In the yeshivish world, it's the beginning of the new Zman, which, of course, makes Elul self-Elul, self-motivated. And the regesh is important. The emotions are necessary and they're important. But you have to be careful not to allow the emotions to take over the experience, because if the emotions take over the experience, there will not be any ma'aseh b'pel, there won't be any action. And actions are taken, and actions are sustained, and actions are good if they're realistic, if they're practical, if we can actually do them and do them consistently and literally and really and actually grow and change. That's what it comes down to, growing and changing. And this is our avodah. Our avodah is to approach Elul constructively, to approach Elul in a way that we actually change little things, but real things. Whether it's a midah teva, whether it's a relationship with one person, whether it's one aspect of our Torah avodah lives, a better Krishma Shalamita, a better Berchas HaShachar, more careful about going to shul and davening with a minyan, not talking in davening, not talking in tefillin, being more careful about bracha rishono, and so on and so forth. We choose little things to correct. Because when we choose big things to correct, we end up correcting nothing. And when we choose little things, one of the things I always tell people is, and I tell it to myself also, when you fix a small piece of yourself, you're fixing you. The correction is in a tiny area, but that correction is about discipline. It's about Kabbalah Selah. It's about growth and improvement. And therefore, you're fixing all of you through that little thing, which is actually the direct medium for the correction. We're holding Shoresh Mitzvas Hatefilla perek. And we are 4 lines into the paragraph at the end of the line. And this is our 3rd class on Perek Tezvov. And of course, Perek Tezvov is about V'hoya im shamoya, where we say that the Keli is Gevura and the Oyed is Chesed. What is the combination? The combination is that there is a temperate Chesed, that the Eibusha gives us Chesed, but in a limited way. And when Hashem gives us Chesed in a limited way, that's constructed. In the first parasha of Krishma, the Rebbe called it Toyu, even though the midas Ahava, but the Ahava is to the extent of Gevura, which is B'chol Meidacha Mesidus Nefesh Chaleisa Nefesh, running away from the world. Toyu. The second parasha of Krishma is exactly the opposite. L'sheves Yitzhara, that there's a base of Gevura, and there's an Oyed of Chesed, which is being brought into the world through that base of Gevura. So even though the Giloi, what the Rebbe calls the Pnimius, the Oyed, is Chesed, because the Keli, because the bedrock, because the essence is Gevura, the Chesed comes into the world in a tempered way, in a measured way. And this goes without saying, everybody understands this, that the definition of giving isn't determined by the giver. It's determined by the recipient. If you give somebody something that they don't know how to manage, they don't understand, they can't handle, they can't use constructively, you haven't helped them and you haven't given them anything. Azay is the Mitzvas Hatefilla. That's the fact of life. You give something to somebody if they're able to receive it. You give something to somebody. You give something to somebody if they are able to receive it. That's the way it works. You give something to somebody if they're able to receive it. So therefore the Gevura, which is included in Chesed, is a part of the Chesed itself. And the Rebbe uses the mashal from a gesher, from a bridge. Now let me say this. The mashal of a bridge in Hasidus is always not the way you and I understand the bridge. Because we imagine a bridge as being a tool that allows us to cross over from one side of a river to the other side of the river without touching the water. That's how we understand the bridge. There's water on, there's a land on one side, there's land on the other. It's cut in the middle by a river, by flowing water. And sometimes it can be quite wide and quite deep and quite swift. And you can't swim or whatever the case is. So you build above the water a body that allows you to climb up over the water walk across. That's what a gesher is. The gesher that's described here actually is more like a dam. It's not a gesher that allows us to cross over the water without touching the water, but rather it allows the water to go from one place to another place in a constructive way, meaning to say, the waters by themselves may be raging, and there is a gesher, there is a bridge that modulates, that tempers the water that it should come from this side of the dam to this side of the dam in a way that's measured and controlled. In other words, it's a different concept of a gesher. This is a Kabbalistic idea, of course, and the concept of this gesher is that it's a dam that doesn't stop the water from coming through, but it modulates, it controls how the water comes through. And this obviously says in Kabbalah Svarim that there's ayin beis gishorim, that the concept of a gesher, the concept of a dam, which allows the water to come through partially, so that it comes through in a constructive, in a healthy, in a useful, in a manageable way, is connected to the number 72. Ayin beis gishorim. I did not look it up in Kabbalah, but I've come across it before in Hasidus. We're going to be reading about it now. V'hine, page 244. I'm going to guesstimate 10 lines from the bottom. It's the 5th line into Perek Tezvav. The parsha zuhu b'chinas shem ab. In this parsha vayim shamaya, even though the keli is gevura, but the oil, which what the Rebbe calls the premius, is 72, which is chesed. The hainu ayin beis tevis. It's an allusion to the 72 words. Min v'hoya ad v'samtem, from the word v'hoya until the word v'samtem. Says the Heilig Rebbe, v'hu b'chinas ayin beis gishorim. This refers excuse me, I'm sorry. V'hu b'chinas ayin beis gishorim. This is an allusion to the 72 bridges, and of course it really means dams. Shebebchinas chesed, which is nemidas chesed. V'hainu, this means in other words that oir chesed, the light that's coming through, is talking from kindness. However, it's bekli hagavura, it's coming through the vessel of gavura. Shahashem v'hu ha'oir, the name of the Eibishter, which is Shem Ab, which is an allusion to the Eir who chesed, is kindness. And kindness gives indiscriminately. Kindness just gives generously. Says the Rebbe, however, the vessel is gevura. Which is why in this parsha you also have the word bechara, which is a word that connotes anger, frustration, negativity, because it's midas hagavura. Midas hagavura judges, and because midas hagavura judges, there's always going to be an aspect, there's always going to be an element of severe judgment. However, that's the keli. The keli is gevura, but the oil is chesed. Now, I believe that Bechlal in Teira, there's really no gevura that's just bad. It's just cruel. It's just negative. Esav represents what's called gevura's cautious. Gevura always has an element of chesed. Always has an element of chesed. Even when it says in the Rabbi Paltiel, and then of course it leads to and you lose all the wonderful things that the Eibush gave you. It's also Laman Yirba Yemeichem. How does it finish? Laman Yirba Yemeichem. Even the Gevura in V'chora has an element of kindness. But that's an aspect, that's a detail, which we're not going to go into. But the Rebbe is going to explain the Klolos Ha'inyan of a Hoyim Shamoya, that the Keli is Gevura and the Oid is Chesed, so that the Chesed is healthy, is useful. Obi and Adram explains the Rebbe, Hine Hageshorim, bridges. Now, I don't know how to understand this. This is very different than the way you and I understand the bridge. Like I said before, we understand the bridge as a means of climbing over the water. The Rebbe describes the Gesher as basically a dam. It's not stopping the water. It's simply limiting the flow of the water. It should come in a less concentrated and less forceful way and to be more managed and more useful and more controlled. It's possible that that's how they used to build bridges. That in the olden days, when they build bridges, they basically build a lot of little cubicles, a lot of little rooms. So the water was flowing through these rooms, but by the virtue of the fact that they built these rooms, a limited amount of water went into each room, and above was a means of crossing over. But that's not how the Rebbe Tzemach Tzedek describes it. Again, this is based, of course, on Kabbalah. He describes Gesher as a means of carrying, not of carrying a person from one bank of the river to the opposite bank of the river, but to deliver the water from upstream to downstream in a managed way. A bridge is actually designed as little rooms, cubicles. Their purpose is to hold back the force of the water of the river, but not that they shouldn't flow at all, but rather they should not have their storm, their force, which they would naturally have, but rather that the dam, the bridge, should contain them a little bit. And as a consequence, they should come in a limited way and in a divided way. You have many of these cubicles, right? You don't have a big river in one opening. You have a big river in many openings. So the water is flowing through from upstream to downstream. But instead of coming bemoided with one shetif, with one force, it's being broken up into small little divided components, that the water that comes through each one is limited. Like a transformer in an energy current. Same kind of an idea. Each room, the water should traverse, should come through from upstream to downstream, but in each cheder, the water is affected by the going through the cheder to be slightly different. This is the concept you have in Kabbalah of Ayin Beis Yishalom of 72 bridges. Now, it's even possible that this hasn't said. I don't know. I didn't look. This is an idea of tzimtzum and the supernal waters that have to do with kindness. They should not come below as they are above. Because if they would come below as they are above, in other words, the same force of water, which is at the beginning of the river, would be the same force of water at the end of the river, it would be impossible to create his havas the creation of a limited creation is that they were created now. So we're holding by the nimshal already. Just like the dam doesn't stop the water from going through, but it limits and directs and manages the water that goes through, that it should come through in a manageable way. When the Eibush that creates the world, it says in the pasuk Elam Chesed Yiban with Chesed. But it's present in Shari Yichad at the beginning of Perek Zayin that Olam Chesed Yibana means that the kindness of the Eibush in creating the world was actually a kindness of Gvura. How was the Eibush, quote, nice when he made the world that he limited himself? How is limiting kind? Because if you're not limited, it's not world. You can create the world and destroy it. In order for the world to be, in order for the world to exist, the energy of the Eibishter, which is creating it and sustaining it, has to be worldified, has to be limited. So it's chesed, it's an act of kindness, you're creating a world. But it's gevura, it's an act of kindness that you're creating the world in such a way that the world shall be able to exist, it should be sustainable. And he gives an example, for example, the first day of creation, this says in Sharichas when perek Yud Aleph Arichas. That the first day is associated with chesed, because each of the 6 midas dominated a different day. Chesed dominated the first day, and Buddha dominated the second day, and so forth and so on. It says the Rebbe, on that first day, David created water. On that first day, David created light, etc. He created many things. Anything in creation which has the chesed characteristic was brought into existence on the first day. New chesed is an infinite force, and it's one midah, kindness. How from one midah do you create both water and light, as well as all the other things that are associated with chesed? And of course, the answer is tzimtzumim. Ayin beis gishorim. The idea that the midas chesed of the Eibishter is modulated and contained and limited, that it should create, first of all, finite creations, and second of all, distinct creations, diverse creations. Even though both water and light are both created, nevertheless, at the same time they are. They're entirely different things. We all understand how vastly different water is from light, right? Physically, there's 4 levels. Water is the second, and light is the 4th. The third would be gas. So there's an enormous disparity between the phenomena of water and the phenomena of light. But their function, their definition, their spirituality, the neshama is both chesed. So they're both created on the first day. How does one midah and one day account for such variety in creation? And the answer is v'zeh nasa. The answer is because because the waters of kindness described. They come through these different cubicles, these different chadarim, these different rooms within the dam, which kabbalistically is 72 yesharim. Shein bechin is tzimtzum, they limit. But this phenomena, this process, this idea of limitation is actually the greatest kindness, because only because of these limitations can you have an actual creation. The ismizeh is that even though the midah is only one, chesed, from that midah chesed should come a variety of different creations. Moreover, not only should they be various, but they should be measured and limited. So there should be the creation of finite creations. Now, in Tanya, in Sharichet Ve'emunah, when the Alter Rebbe talks about this, he speaks about 2 basic ideas. Right? The first is that there's 6 midas, and because there's 6 midas, different creations are distinctive because based on the midah from which they come. And then there's of course the oasis of the Asara Mamoret, that the midas come down into words, and depending on what words he speaks, like Yehi Eir, Yehi Mayim, Yilakia, on that basis you can have different kinds of creations. Beklolus, you could say that the Ayin Beis Gishorim is like the Oisius. But Pratius, I think, the Ayin Beis Gishorim are the midas alone. Before you get to the Oisius, before you have the incredible variety and diversity that the words can allow for, in the midah itself, there's Ayin Beis Gishorim, that the midas, like for example, midas chesed, is tempered, and because it's tempered, it comes down in limited ways, in a diverse ways, till the inyan of Ayin Beis. Well, they have 72, but I'm not sure about this. It says the Heilige Rebbe, there's 4 lines, the top of page Kuf Chof Gimel now, that's the phenomenon. That the light is kindness. What's being given is givingness, right? Is kindness, is the Eibishter's generosity. And of course, you know that chesed has a series of characteristics. Number 1, it's giving, from a high place to a low place. Number 2, it's adhesive, right? It attaches, it joins things together. And basically means the giver and the receiver, the Eibishter and the creation. And number 3, it's soft. And number 4, it dilutes, it doesn't nitpick, it doesn't see every tiny, it doesn't exacerbate every tiny little anomaly. Those are the characteristics of Midas HaChesed. Midas HaChesed comes into the world with a Gevura. So that this kindness, this flow, should be tempered and measured and allow for diversities to create many different creations. This is the phenomenon of the light of kindness in the vessel of Gevura. The light, the intent is kindness. It's made whole, perfect, and peaceful, and complete. Love they pay mamish to be actualized. Midas ha Gevura Davka, to the measure of Gevura Davka. What is Gevura? Latam Tameir Vachai is that the light and the life, which of course, if you are Makubal, keeping score at home, you will know that Eir means like Seviv, Eir Makim, and life means like Mamale, Eir Pnimi. And in both cases, the Ayin Beis Yeshadim, the Keli of Gevura tempers them. It says that Ebezeu Sheshem Ab the Chesed. This explains something even much Edeler. Because according to what we said so far, the second parasha of Kirishma is a composite. It's a combination of a Keli of Gevura and an Eid of Chesed. And the Eid of Chesed, the impression that you get is that it would deliver kindness ad infinitum, an Eifin of B'li Gevura that would not allow for creation. And the Keli of Gevura limits it. Says the Rebbe, no. Not only is it that the Eid, which by itself is kind and infinite and uniform and unified and one, is limited and diversified and so forth by the Keli, but in the Eid itself there's already Gevura. Where do you see it? It gives you math. Shem Ab, the Abish's name, Ayin Beis 72, is Merumez in Chumash. And I think it says even in the Rishonim. And I don't remember if I saw it in the Rishonim. I think it's at Rashi someplace, or maybe in a Gemara. But if you want to read about it, Oisfilach take out the Torah Shleima from Menachem Kasher, Menachem Mendel Kasher, who was one of the greatest Goyim of our time. And the Rebbe absolutely loved his Sfarim. And he made a sefer called Torah Shleima. He never completed it, but now they printed, I think, Matas and Maseh. But Pashat B'Shalach. In Pashat B'Shalach, the way his sefer works is that he brings every medrash and every pasuk with very, very creative and thoughtful and goinish notes. Sometimes the note is 3 lines, sometimes the note is a whole book. So one of the notes that he has in Pashat B'Shalach is what's called by, what is it called here? Forgive me, I'm sorry, it's not nice to look in front of mit Nashiyah, darf noch sein zugegerät. Yeah, you're supposed to be prepared. Vayisa, Vayove, Vayet. This Yudalit, Vashalach Pasuk, capital Yudalit, Pasuk Yites, Chaf and Chafav. Each one of these 3 psukim has 72 letters. Each one of these 3 psukim has 72 letters. And the 72 Ab is a name of 72 Oisias. But more specifically, it's a name of 72 words. And he enumerates what the 72 words are. He also has a whole discussion from all kinds of Sfarim what the Shem Ab means. In Pashat, again, in Torah Shleima, Pashat B'Shalach. And the way it works is that you count the first letter of the first pasuk, the last letter of the second pasuk, and the first letter of the third pasuk. So the first Shem would be Vav, Hey Vav. Vav Kivav, Vayisa Malach Elokim. The last word of pasuk Chaf is Haloila, and the first pasuk of Aleph is Vayet. Then you would count the second Shem would be Yud, Lamed, and Yud. In other words, the first letter of the second letter of the first pasuk, the second to the last letter of the second pasuk, and the second from the first letter of the third pasuk. And the third Shem would be Samach and Yud and Tes, and the fourth Shem would be Ayin and Lamed and Mem, and so on. It's Ayin Beis Shemus. If you do 72 times 3, you get 216. What is 216? 216 is the Gematria Gvura and Aryeh, if I'm not mistaken. Gvura, Reish is 200, Gimel and Beis is 5, and Vav is 11, and Hey is 16. Gvura is 216. And Aryeh, if I'm not mistaken, Reish is 200, and Aleph and Yud and Hey is 16. So the Pnimius of the Shem of Chesed is Gvura. Ayin Beis 72 is Begimatia Chesed. Chesed is 8, Samach is 60, Dal is 4, 8 and 4 is 12, 12 and 60, 72. So the Pnimius of Shem Chesed, which is Shem Ab, is 3 times 72, which is Begimatria Gvura. So the point that the Rebbe is now making is that not only is it the pshat that the shame of Ab is Oyer HaChesed is being tailored and tempered by the Keli of Gvura, the Eir HaChesed is being tempered and tailored by itself. In the Chesed is already Ninyan HaGevura. And that's what he now says. When you understand the Vayisa, whatever it is, Vayet, I forgot to see Psukim already, that add up to the Ayin Beis Shemus. Like I said, if you want to see it, take out a Teilah Shleim Pasuk B'Shalach, where he explains it and he brings sources for it and he actually writes out all 72 Shemus. It adds up to 216 letters, Shugamati Yevur, and also, like I said, Aryeh. Mishum Shu'eira Chesed B'Kli Agvura. Because in the Chesed itself, for the Chesed to be kind, not to be the opposite of kind, there has to be a tailoring and a limitation, which is in Agavura. So stop. So I think you have two concepts here. The first concept is that the Chesed is tailored by the Keli of Gevura. The second concept is that in the Chesed itself, there's already the beginning of the Gevura. And then the Rebbe continues from this idea, you find in the Mishnah beginning of a Sechta Tainus. When you're talking about rain, and of course rain is water, and nobody's going to debate that the union of rain is union from kindness that comes from heaven to earth. The Mishnah calls that be'emes ha'maskirin gevura is geshamim. That the union of Geshem is midas ha'gevura. Says the Rebbe sheyodim be'gevura, that they descend with a severity, with an exactitude. Also, like it says in the Apostle in Siddur, made it a Geshem ba'ata gibe. The bracha that talks about rain is called gevura. Even though the rain is a maximum chesed, is an absolute chesed, it's called gevura. Now, in Chassidus, when they bring the idea of gevuras geshamim, they say something even deeper. They say that these gevuras come from gevuras of Atika Kadisha, that every raindrop has a property of etzem, which is l'chayra different than of gevura. In other words, if you really wanted to split hairs, you could say this is even a third idea, but we don't need to get that involved. The point is that kindness, if it's to be kind, is going to be limited. And the limitation is the gevura with the chesed. And that's the second parsha of Kishma v'haya im shomoya. And the oyer, or the pnimius, as the Tzemach Tzedek calls it, is chesed. And the keli, which we discussed, is in another way, pnimius, is gevura. And keli, or gevura, the vessel is gevura l'chalak, hashpala deep into effect that would come to us from heaven to earth to be drops. The light, and more important, the intent and the purpose of this light is chesed gomer, is absolute kindness. Meaning to say this: water comes to the world in different ways, because water serves different purposes. Water doesn't only come to the world for drinking; it also comes to the world for irrigation, because it's necessary for life, for plant life, vegetation, for growth. So it comes from heaven to earth. But when rain comes from heaven to earth, you have the nice with Cheni Amagel, you don't want it to be too much, you don't want it to be too little, you want it to be just right. So the Eibishter built into the way rain comes from heaven to earth, this idea of gevura, it comes in drops, tipping. Because if it came in more than drops, it would be very destructive. Im ho yoshetef, there will be a flood. Like the way the Torah describes the windows of heaven opening in the times of the Mabel, of the flood, and the implication that the Tzemach Tzedek is learning in the words of Rubas Hashemayim is that the water didn't come from heaven in a heavy rain. It came in a deluge. It came from heaven like a flood. And notice the word windows, Arubes. Arubes is also a dinyan of Gesharim. So even by the Mabel, there's a certain dinyan from Gevura, but Tzadachiyur. Lo Yahoi Gidlat to a cloud, nothing could grow. The water would just wash away everything. Therefore, says the Rebbe, this is the pshat of the second parsha of Kriya Shema. The Eid is Chesed and the Keli is Gevura. The Eid is Chesed and the Keli of Gevura, like the Mashal of Gesharim. The Eid is Chesed and the Keli of Gevura, like the idea that Shem Ab has 216 aces, which is the Gematria Gevura and Aryeh, and the idea of Gevura is Gesharim. The Rebbe finishes with a very interesting word. It's a very unusual instance where Moshe Rabbeinu is talking about the Eibishter giving us blessings, but he says, I will give. Everybody who's learned Chumash knows that Sefer Devarim, Mishnah, Torah is written in a way that Moshe is the narrator. Moshe Rabbeinu wrote by himself. Of course, there's different definitions of what Moshe Kosvei. According to the Ramban, it was dictated that way. Hashem told him to write it in this signet. According to other Rishonim, that it was a lower madrega. In other words, Moshe Rabbeinu wrote, and the Eibishter inspired his words, rather than Moshe Rabbeinu simply being a mashpech, simply repeating after the Eibishter. But in either case, in Sefer Devarim, the first person, the narrator, is not an unknown entity, like in the first four Chamashim. Hashem said to Moshe that he should repeat to the Jewish people, who's writing Hashem said to Moshe, we don't know. But in Sefer Devarim, except for the very beginning and the very, very end, it's I. I said and I told them, we went and we did and we reminded them, we remembered and we didn't do, and so on and so forth. And in our passages, I will give you rain. I will, the Moshe Rabbeinu give rain, the Eibishter gives rain. This is mentioned in the Geras HaKedesh, I think it's put over there in the name of the Ramban. That the Pashas Vayera, when the Malachim came to Avraham Avinu, and they promised him and Sarah, his Rebbetzin, Ben Zocher, it says, Sheiv Ashov Elecha Ke'ez Chaya V'nei Ben Sarah Ishtecha. I'm going to come back to you at this time, and a year from now, and your wife's going to have a little baby. Who came back a year later? Not the Malach, the Eibishter. But the Malach during Yeshlich is so bottled to Hashem that when he says Sheiv Ashov, he's speaking as if he's the Eibishter. And in Kuntis Achron over there, he explains this when he gets to Malachim and the between Malachim and Neshamis and all kinds of other things. Here you have a Moshe Rabbeinu. That Moshe Rabbeinu was so bottled to Hashem, is I will give rain. Taich is the Rebbe. You find no place else in Teda. Moshe Rabbeinu should say, I'm going to give you rain. In other words, Moshe Rabbeinu achieved such a state of his battle HaKadosh Baruch Hu, that the eye of Moshe Rabbeinu was one with the Lakus. Hagam, the Shechina mitaberes derkein b'chol the whole Teda. The Shechina is speaking through the throat of Moshe Rabbeinu. Moshe Rabbeinu is a mashpech. Nevertheless, it doesn't usually say that Moshe Rabbeinu is one with the Lakus, to the extent that he says I, and he means the Eibishter. The answer is Shapar says Shema Kodma. Since before we said V'hoyim Shemay, we said Shema. And of course, in the Pasha Shema Hoyoloi Mesiras Nefesh, Bepasha Shema, the first Pasha of Kishma, the infamous Mesiras Nefesh. He is nothing other than the fact that he reveals godliness. Therefore, in the second Pasha, it has been Asat. In the first Pasha, Kriyish Meish, it says Avayalak and Avayachot. Even though the Mid is Ahava, the Avos Betakbedes, it's in Yifan Ratzur, what the Rebbe called in the beginning of this Perek. And in yesterday's class, Tehu, and therefore in the second Pasha, which is Nyani Chesed, Moshe Rabbeinu says Benasat. Now, I'm reserving the right to revisit these last three lines tomorrow. But I'm not promising what I'm going to do. I'm going to rethink it. So later tomorrow, either we're going to reread the end of Tezvav and start Tezayin, or I'm going to start Perek Tezayin. And I thank you all for coming, and I wish you all a good morning. And Ksivach Sivir Teva, Shat Bracha, Vatzlacha, Bagashma Seferuchni, Nebana Chaim Ezen Revicha, Bukom Avicha, Hatzlacha in Teira, Hatzlacha in Aveda, Hatzlacha in Mas Chasadim, Hatzlacha in Somiran, Hatzlacha in Asay Tev, Hatzlacha in Asay Tev, Hatzlacha in Somirah. And we should have the Gula Shleim